When I turned 14, my father didn't buy me a bike, a game console, or even a birthday card. He sat me down at the worn kitchen table, placed a yellow legal pad in front of me, and pushed a pen across the formica surface. On that sheet, written in his neat cursive, was an itemized list. $4 for every family dinner I ate. $25 a week for my share of the electricity and water. $50 a month for the small, windowless bedroom above the garage. I stared at the paper, assuming it was a bizarre joke. My brother, Julian, was sitting on the living room sofa 10 feet away, playing a brand new video game on a console my parents had bought him 3 days prior. My mother stood near the stove, wiping down the counters, refusing to meet my eyes. When I asked my father what would happen if I couldn't pay, he didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "Then you don't eat our food, and you find somewhere else to sleep. You're 14. You're old enough to pull your own weight. We aren't running a charity." That was the night the warmth left my childhood. I had two choices: surrender and starve, or figure out how to survive in my own home. I got a job the next afternoon. I walked 3 miles down the bypass to a local diner, lied about my age to the owner, a grumpy but fair man named Marcus, and started washing dishes for cash under the table. I washed grease off industrial trays until my knuckles bled and my skin turned raw. Every Sunday night, I handed my father a crisp $50 bill and a stack of small bills to cover my food and utilities. He would count the cash carefully, slide it into his leather wallet without a word of thanks, and check my name off a ledger he kept in his desk drawer. Julian never paid a dime. Julian was 2 years older than me, gifted, handsome, and slated for greatness, at least according to my mother. Every dollar my parents stripped from my pockets went directly into a savings account marked for Julian's future college tuition. While I did my high school homework by a flashlight in my cold garage room to cut down on electricity charges, Julian had a private tutor and a monthly allowance. I learned two things very early in life. Money was power, and paper trails were survival. Because my father insisted on treating our family like a commercial business, I started treating him like a hostile vendor. Every time I handed over cash for rent or groceries, I forced him to sign a small receipt book I bought at a dollar store. He thought it was ridiculous and laughed in my face the first time I held out the pen, but I stood my ground. "If this is a business agreement," I told him quietly, "I want proof of payment." He snorted, signed his initials, and went back to watching television. By the time I graduated from high school, I had 6 filled receipt books locked in a metal firebox under my mattress, alongside pay stubs from 2 separate jobs. While other teenagers were going to prom and planning summer road trips, I was working 60 hours a week between the diner and an auto repair shop down the street. The day after my 18th birthday, my father handed me a new piece of paper. It was a formal notice to vacate, giving me 30 days to pack my belongings because Julian was dropping out of college to start a home improvement business, and he needed my garage room for office space. My mother didn't say goodbye when I carried my 2 canvas duffel bags down the driveway. She just reminded me to leave the key on the kitchen counter. I walked away, but I didn't leave the city. I moved into a basement apartment with 3 roommates, enrolled in a community college program for civil engineering during the day, and worked night shifts managing maintenance for commercial properties. I lived on instant noodles and cheap coffee, saving every single dollar that didn't go toward tuition or rent. While I built my life from the ground up, Julian's grand business plans unfolded exactly as you might expect. He burned through his entire college fund in 6 months buying custom trucks, expensive tools, and office furniture he couldn't afford. When the business failed, my parents didn't hold him accountable. Instead, my father took out a second mortgage on their 4-bedroom suburban house to clear Julian's debts and fund his second venture, a boutique contracting company. That failed too. Then came a third business, a restaurant venture that went under in less than a year. Through all of it, my parents acted as his endless personal bank, liquidating their retirement accounts, maxing out credit cards, and taking out loans to keep Julian afloat while he drove luxury cars and lived above his means. They never called me. Not once, in 12 years. To them, I was just the self-sufficient, cold child who had moved out and disappeared. They didn't know that after graduating with honors, I had transitioned into real estate acquisition and commercial property management. They didn't know that, by 30, I had built a modest portfolio of residential rental properties across the county. And they certainly didn't know that 6 months ago, my father's reckless financial decisions finally caught up with him. I received a notification from an estate liquidator and private debt broker I worked with regularly in the region. A residential mortgage note on a 4-bedroom house on Willow Street was being auctioned off by a private lender. The homeowners had defaulted on a massive equity line of credit, money they had pulled out to cover a failed commercial lease for their eldest son, and the primary lender was initiating foreclosure proceedings to recoup their losses. The address on the file was Willow Street, my childhood home. I sat at my desk in my office, looking at the public records on my computer screen. My father had stacked 3 separate liens against the property. The total debt far exceeded the actual market value of the house. The bank didn't want the hassle of managing an auction on a property with so many encumbrances, so they were selling the debt package at a steep discount just to cut their losses. My heart didn't race, my blood didn't boil. A strange, serene clarity washed over me. I didn't buy the house out of anger. I bought it because it was a sound, calculated transaction. I executed the purchase through a private limited liability company I owned, an entity called Crestview Holdings, paying off the bank's discounted note in full. Within 48 hours, the legal title and the underlying mortgage debt belonged entirely to my LLC. My parents didn't know the house had been sold to a private entity. All they knew was that the bank had stopped calling them, which led my father to make his fatal mistake. He assumed he had somehow beaten the system, or that the lender had simply given up. Instead of trying to cure their default, my parents doubled down on their denial. Julian moved back into the house, bringing his new girlfriend and 2 dogs, completely rent-free, while my father stopped making payments altogether. 3 months after I acquired the deed, I initiated formal legal proceedings for long overdue debt recovery and unlawful detainer. I didn't send a process server. I hired a senior paralegal from my legal team, accompanied by a court officer, to serve the formal notice of ownership change, debt demand, and 30-day notice to quit. The notice gave them a simple choice: pay the full back balance owed on the primary debt, an amount totaling nearly $80,000, or face immediate formal eviction through the county court. 2 days later, my personal cell phone rang. I hadn't changed my number in 15 years. I picked up on the 3rd ring. Hello? Is this Marcus? My mother's voice came through the speaker, frail, trembling, and distinctly older than I remembered. It is, I said calmly. Marcus. Oh, thank God, she sobbed. We didn't know who else to call. Something terrible is happening. Some heartless corporate entity called Crestview Holdings bought our mortgage. They served us with court papers. They're trying to throw us out of our home. Your father is in complete shock. Julian is trying to figure out what to do, but we need financial help. We need a lawyer or a loan, just until Julian gets his new project off the ground. I know, I interrupted softly. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. What do you mean, you know? I know about the notice. I signed it. Silence stretched over the line for 5 full seconds. I could hear the faint murmur of my father's voice in the background, asking her who was on the phone. Marcus, what are you talking about? My mother asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. I am Crestview Holdings, Mother. I own the note on the house. In fact, I own the deed. A sharp intake of breath whistled through the receiver. You bought our house? I bought the debt you accumulated to finance Julian's business failures, I corrected her coldly. And now, as the legal owner of the property, I am executing my rights. Marcus! How could you do this to your family? Her voice suddenly shifted from tearful desperation to shrill, defensive outrage. We are your parents. We gave you a roof over your head. You're going to kick your own mother and father out onto the street? A roof over my head, I chuckled softly, looking down at my desk where a dark leather box sat in the top drawer. You charged me $50 a month for a cold room above a garage when I was 14 years old. You charged me $4 every time I put a forkful of your food in my mouth. You made me pay for my own electricity while I studied by flashlight. That was to teach you responsibility, she yelled, her voice trembling with rage. We were teaching you the value of $1. You were always so ungrateful. Then you should be thrilled, I replied smoothly, because I learned the lesson perfectly. I learned that shelter isn't free, family isn't a charity, and debts must be paid in full. Let me speak to him. My father's harsh, grating voice suddenly blasted through the speaker as he snatched the phone from my mother. Listen to me, you arrogant little bastard. You think you can use some legal trickery to steal my house? I built this family. You owe us everything you have. I will take you to court. I'll tell the judge what kind of sociopath buys his parents' home just to throw them out. You're welcome to try, Dad, I said, keeping my tone completely level. In fact, I encourage you to bring all your financial records to the hearing next Tuesday. I'll be bringing mine. What records? He bellowed. The small yellow receipt books you signed every Sunday night from the time I was 14 until the day you threw me out, I said. The ones where you meticulously documented that I paid market rent as a minor for 4 straight years. The court will be very interested to see the long history of commercial transactions between us. It establishes quite clearly that our relationship has always been purely financial. The line went dead quiet. My father didn't scream. He didn't curse. The memory of those small receipts, the tiny paper trail he had treated as a joke 15 years ago, finally registered. He realized in an instant that he wasn't dealing with an angry, emotional child seeking revenge. He was dealing with a creditor who had documented every single step of their shared history. "You have 28 days left on the notice," I said quietly. "If you, Julian, and Mother are not out of the house by the first of the month, the sheriff will oversee the removal of your personal property. Goodbye, Dad." I hung up the phone and did not block their numbers. I didn't need to. Over the next 3 weeks, the campaign of guilt began. Uncles I hadn't spoken to in a decade called my office, leaving furious voicemails accusing me of being heartless, cruel, and monstrous. Aunts sent long, rambling text messages demanding to know how I could treat my parents this way after everything they had sacrificed. I didn't argue with any of them. Instead, whenever a relative reached out to condemn me, I replied with a single PDF document, a scanned copy of my father's original legal pad from my 14th birthday, detailing the charges for my food, utilities, and room rent, alongside 3 scanned receipts signed by my father's own hand. Below the image, I wrote a simple, standardized message. My parents established the financial terms of our relationship when I was 14 years old. I am simply enforcing the standards they taught me. If you are concerned about their housing situation, you are welcome to offer them a room in your home rent-free. Not a single relative replied after receiving that email. Not one offered to take my parents in. The day of the court hearing arrived. My father showed up in a faded suit, flanked by a court-appointed legal aid attorney who looked visibly exhausted. Julian sat in the back row of the gallery, glaring at me in an expensive jacket he clearly couldn't afford, avoiding my gaze whenever I looked in his direction. My legal team presented the chain of title, the defaulted mortgage documents, and the formal notices served on the property. My father's attorney attempted to argue financial hardship and elder vulnerability, asking the judge for a 6-month extension to allow the family to find alternative living arrangements. When the judge asked if the property owner had any prior financial agreements with the occupants, my attorney handed forward a bound binder. Inside were the itemized ledger entries showing that my father had treated the primary residence as an income-generating asset by charging his minor child rent decades prior, demonstrating a long-standing pattern of strictly commercial interactions regarding the living quarters. The judge looked over the documents, raised his eyebrows, and looked down at my father over his glasses. The courtroom was dead quiet. "The petition for eviction is granted," the judge stated firmly, snapping the file shut. "The occupants have 14 days to vacate the premises entirely. No extensions." 14 days later, I drove my truck to Willow Street. It was a crisp autumn afternoon. A large orange moving van was parked in the driveway. Workers were carrying out taped cardboard boxes, worn sofas, and bedroom furniture. My father stood on the front lawn, his hair entirely gray, looking frail and stooped in the pale sunlight. My mother sat in the passenger seat of Julian's sedan, staring blankly out the window, refusing to look at the house. Julian was arguing heatedly with one of the movers about the cost of the trip, waving his arms in frustration. When he saw my truck pull up to the curb, he froze, glared at me with pure hatred, and got into his car, slamming the door so hard the frame shook. I didn't get out of my truck immediately. I sat in the driver's seat, watching them load the last of their belongings. My father walked slowly toward my window. I rolled it down halfway. He stopped 2 feet away, looking at me through the gap. He didn't look angry anymore. He just looked defeated, hollowed out by the weight of his own choices. "You really destroyed us, didn't you?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You took everything we had." "I didn't take anything from you, Dad," I replied, looking him straight in the eyes. "You gave everything to Julian, and you sold the rest to me $30 at a time when I was 14 years old. You taught me that everything in this world has a price. I just finally saved up enough to buy the lease." He stared at me for a long moment, opened his mouth as if to say something else, but realized there were no words left. He turned around, walked over to Julian's car, and climbed into the back seat. A moment later, the sedan pulled out of the driveway and drove down the street, disappearing around the corner toward a cheap 2-bedroom apartment Julian had been forced to sign a lease on using his remaining credit line. I got out of my truck, walked up the concrete path, and stepped onto the front porch. The front door was wide open, revealing a completely empty living room with scuffed hardwood floors and faded rectangles on the walls where family photographs used to hang. I walked inside, the sound of my boots echoing off the bare walls. I walked down the narrow hallway, past the master bedroom, and up the creaky stairs that led to the small, windowless space above the garage. The room was completely bare. The old fluorescent light fixture hummed overhead, casting a cold, white glow across the empty floorboards. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the small metal firebox I had carried with me for 16 years, and opened it. Inside were the 6 receipt books, worn at the edges, filled with my father's faded signature. I laid the books neatly on the windowsill, left the brass key to the front door sitting right beside them, and turned off the light. I walked out of the house, locked the door behind me with my own master set, and drove back to my office. My parents thought they were building a golden child while discarding the responsible one. They thought they were in total control of the narrative, using money to exert power when I was weak, small, and helpless. But power built on exploitation always expires the moment the exploited party stops accepting the terms. I didn't ruin my family. I simply let them live in the world they spent decades creating. A world where nothing is given, debts are collected, and actions have real, unavoidable consequences. What would you have done if your parents made you pay rent as a child? Would you have bought their mortgage when they defaulted? Or would you have walked away entirely? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you believe that self-respect, boundaries, and long-term strategy always prevail, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Real Cold Revenge for more stories like this.